Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. Today we will tell the story of William Shakespeare, the man whose name has become a synonym for great drama, mystery, and the genius of the word. You will learn how he grew up in the provincial town of Stratford, why he married at the age of 18 a woman older than himself, and where he disappeared for many years before suddenly emerging in London as a mature playwright. We will follow Shakespeare's path from his first steps on stage to the creation of his greatest tragedies, Hamlet, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, and see how he could play not only with words, but with the very soul of man. This is the story not merely of a playwright, but of a man who changed the world forever without ever leaving the stage. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. In the very heart of England, among the gentle hills of Warwickshire and the quiet waters of the River Avon, lay a small town, whose name would later be forever linked with the greatest playwright of all time. Stratford upon Avon in the 16th century was a modest trading center with a population of about 1,500 people, artisans, shopkeepers, farmers, and clergymen. It was here, in the spring of 1564, in a house on Henley Street, that a boy was born who was destined to rethink theater, language, and the very idea of human nature. His name was William Shakespeare. The house in which he was born belonged to his father, John Shakespeare, a glover and dealer in wool, leather, and grain. John was not merely a craftsman, but an ambitious man. He bought several houses, held positions in the town council, and in 1568 was elected bailiff, effectively the mayor of Stratford. His wife, Mary Arden, came from a prosperous family, owned part of her father's estate, and was descended from an old line of landed gentry. Their marriage united urban wealth with rural nobility, making the Shakespeare family respected in local society. William was the third of 8 children, but childhood mortality was high. Only 5 survived. His exact date of birth is unknown, but he was baptized on the 26th of April, 1564, in the parish church of the Holy Trinity. Since infants were usually baptized within a few days of birth, it is generally assumed that William was born on the 23rd of April, a date that would later become symbolic, for on that same day, 52 years later, he would die, leaving behind an immortal legacy. Stratford in those days was a town where daily life was bound to the rhythm of nature, sowing and harvest, fairs, church festivals, street processions, and the simple cares of everyday existence. There were no universities, but there were masters and merchants whose children, like William, learned to observe the world in its most vivid and earthly forms. He grew up among people whose faces, voices, habits, and passions he would later capture with astonishing truth in his plays. Little is known of Shakespeare's early education, but he most likely attended the King's New School of Stratford, situated near the church. The school was free for the sons of officials, and boys began their studies around the age of 7. Latin was the language of instruction, and even in the lower forms pupils memorized the works of Terence, Cicero, Ovid, and Virgil, translating them into English and back again, while studying rhetoric, logic, and public disputation. Lessons were held 6 days a week, beginning around 6 in the morning and ending only at evening, with a short break for lunch. Discipline was strict. Corporal punishment was common, for the age itself was stern. Yet it was probably there that his love of words, of drama, of classical stories and characters began to take shape, the very foundations of the art that would later fill the stage of the globe. Life in the town was not limited to study. Festivals, fairs, and performances by traveling actors were part of everyday life. Troupes often visited Stratford, some under the patronage of nobles, and young William could well have seen simple plays on biblical or mythological themes. These spectacles, full of jesters, disguises, and applause, left deep impressions, especially contrasted with the discipline of the schoolroom. He grew up in a country undergoing great change. After the break with Rome, England was already Protestant, but in popular life, many pre-Christian customs survived. Spring rituals, evening tales, folk songs, and ancient legends lived on in homes, streets, and memory. It was a world where medieval symbolism coexisted with Renaissance ideas, where magic met law and fate met will. On this soil his worldview was formed, not divided by sharp contrasts, but attuned to nuance, detail, and inner conflict. Yet the harmony did not last. In the early 1570s, the family's fortunes declined. John lost political standing, avoided paying church taxes, disappeared from civic records, and in 1579 was removed from the list of council members. The reasons remain uncertain: debts, failed business, or political friction, but the result was the same: a fall in social status which likely affected William's opportunities. Some scholars suggest that during these years he may have left school to help his father, in the workshop or at the market, as many boys did. Perhaps he learned the trade, kept the shop, or simply watched the adult world that demanded growing independence from him. In any case, this period, marked by both work and observation, shaped his character and inner world. We do not know what the young William felt walking through the streets of his hometown, past stone houses, leather shops, spice stalls, and noisy taverns, hearing merchants' cries, widows' prayers, craftsmen's sighs, and infants' cries. But reading his plays, one senses. He saw and heard everything. He was a keen witness to life, able to draw universal meaning from the most ordinary scenes. When William Shakespeare turned 18, his name appeared for the first time in official documents, in connection with a marriage. In November 1582, a church license was issued for his swift wedding to Anne Hathaway, a woman 8 years his senior who was already pregnant. Such a license, a marriage bond, allowed the couple to marry without the usual 3 weeks of public bans. In the moral climate of the time, this was crucial to ensure that the child would be born within wedlock. Anne Hathaway came from a well-off farming family in the village of Shottery, only about 2 kilometers from Stratford. Her father, Richard Hathaway, had been a prosperous landowner and had died the year before her marriage, leaving her part of his estate. She probably helped run the household and lived with her family. Little is known of her relationship with William. Only brief records survive. Yet the absence of scandal in her later life in the Shakespeare home suggests that the marriage was accepted by both families and was not considered shameful. On the 26th of May, 1583, 6 months after the wedding, the parish register of the Holy Trinity Church recorded the baptism of their daughter, named Susanna. Almost 2 years later, in February 1585, the couple had twins, a boy, Hamlet, and a girl, Judith. The name Hamlet, then quite rare, was likely chosen in honor of Hamlet Sadler, one of Shakespeare's close friends and a respected townsman. Judith was named after Sadler's wife. This points to warm relations between the families and to the Shakespeare's active place in Stratford society. Yet after 1585, a mysterious silence falls. Shakespeare vanishes from all records for nearly 7 years. No letters, no contracts, no taxes, no church entries, nothing. The next reliable date is 1592, when he appears in a pamphlet by playwright Robert Greene, who mockingly refers to a conceited upstart crow who thinks he can rival educated university writers. Most historians agree that the target was Shakespeare, the newcomer without a degree who was already gaining fame. What happened in those lost years? History is silent, imagination is not. One theory suggests he worked as a schoolmaster in northern England, perhaps among Catholic families, which might explain his cautious approach to religion in his plays. Others think he was a clerk, a notary's assistant, a traveling trader, or that he joined a troupe of players touring the countryside, including Stratford. Another persistent legend claims that he was caught poaching deer on the estate of Sir Thomas Lucy, a local landowner, and fled to London to escape punishment, having written a mocking verse about his pursuer. No such poem survives, yet the tale endured. Society wanted an origin story, a moment of exile to explain his sudden rise. He may well have lived partly in Stratford and partly away, working quietly without leaving paper traces. His wife and children remained in the family home. His mother Mary and Anne with the children lived there. No signs of conflict or separation are recorded. When he later achieved fame and wealth, he bought a house in Stratford and continued to return there for holidays, ultimately dying there. The absence of records does not mean the absence of life. The 16th century was not an age of bureaucracy. People worked, traveled, and even made deals without documentation. Shakespeare may have been writing, for himself or for others, reading, acting, learning, or serving in a noble household. Those shadowed years filled him with the experiences and reflections that would later pour into his plays. As for his marriage, much remains uncertain. The age gap, years of separation, and the sparse mention of Anne in his will have inspired many speculations about estrangement. Yet his bequest to her, of the second-best bed, often misunderstood as slight, may in fact have been tender, referring to their shared marital bed. By the early 1590s, however, Shakespeare had reappeared, now in London, firmly linked to the world of the theatre. What lay before that moment remains a dark room full of guesses and shadows, and perhaps that mystery is part of his enduring aura. By the early 1590s, London was alive and tumultuous. It was a vast city for its time, home to more than 100,000 souls and growing rapidly. Its streets were narrow and noisy, its markets crowded, the bridge over the Thames lined with houses and shops. But beyond trade and craft, London was also the beating heart of theatre. Vivid, talkative, sometimes coarse, always passionate. It was here that Shakespeare entered public life, and here that his road to immortality began. The first trustworthy mention of him as a playwright dates to 1592. In the pamphlet A Groat's Worth of Wit, published posthumously under Robert Greene's name, appears a jealous jab at an upstart crow who imagines he can compete with university-trained dramatists. The allusion unmistakably points to Shakespeare, a self-taught newcomer already winning favor among audiences. By then, he was associated with the acting company known as the Lord Chamberlain's Men, one of England's finest troupes. He began as an actor himself, touring, performing, playing small parts, perhaps even the ghosts and fathers of his later plays. Tradition suggests he might have appeared as the ghost in Hamlet. It was on stage that he learned what made words live. Soon he was writing plays, The Comedy of Errors, The Taming of the Shrew, Titus Andronicus, early works of great variety from farce to bloody tragedy. They show echoes of Marlowe, Seneca, and popular comedy, yet already reveal his keen eye for character and dialogue, and his talent for fusing the lofty with the familiar. Living within the theatre, he understood what audiences felt, when they would laugh, hold their breath, or lose attention, and wrote accordingly. Late 16th century London was the theatre capital of England. Playhouses stood outside the city walls, in suburbs less policed by church and crown, names like the Theatre, the Curtain, the Rose, and the Swan. Performances took place by daylight, mostly in the afternoon. The audience was mixed: apprentices, laborers, merchants, nobles. In the pit stood the groundlings, who paid 1 penny and shouted, hissed, or clapped with abandon. Shakespeare mastered this crowd. His early plays were full of movement, puns, satire, and surprise. He wrote not to be read, but to be spoken. His characters were alive, many-voiced, restless. His history plays, Henry VI, Richard III, stirred patriotic pride, and pleased both court and people. In 1594, after theaters reopened following an outbreak of plague, Shakespeare strengthened his position. He became not just the troupe's writer, but one of its shareholders. That brought steady income and influence in its affairs, and it prepared him for the defining creation of his career. In 1599, the company built its own playhouse, the Globe. It stood on the south bank of the Thames in Southwark, built partly from the timbers of a dismantled earlier theatre. The Globe was circular, open to the sky, and could hold up to 3,000 spectators. The stage jutted into the yard. Galleries and boxes rose around it. When it opened in the summer of 1599, one of the first plays performed was likely Henry V. Shakespeare was not merely the Globe's writer, he was its co-owner. That changed everything. He now earned a share of profits, wrote for specific actors, and shaped the repertory. Chief among those actors was Richard Burbage, the brilliant performer for whom Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear were written. The comedian Will Kemp inspired his early jesters and servants. The theatrical life of the time was intense. Performances almost daily, plays rotated frequently, rehearsals brief, costumes reused, sets minimal. The imagination carried the burden. Castles, storms, and battlefields existed through verse and gesture. Shakespeare wrote for that world, for its rhythm and for the power of speech itself. By 1603, the troupe had new royal patronage. King James I made them the King's Men. This royal favor brought prestige and access to court performances. Shakespeare's plays were now acted before nobles as well as crowds. It was the height of recognition and the beginning of his most profound works. Before writing his later meditations on fate and forgiveness, he would give the world the tragedies that made his name eternal, stories of pain, doubt, love, betrayal, ambition, and the cost of power. In them live Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and Richard III. By the beginning of the 17th century, William Shakespeare was no longer merely a famous playwright, but a figure woven into the very fabric of London's theatrical life. His plays were staged on the city's principal stages. The public knew his name. Actors and patrons debated his texts. Yet it is precisely in the tragedies written during this period that he reaches his greatest depth. In them, drama ceases to be a genre of entertainment and becomes a genre of revelation. Shakespeare creates figures in whom fate and choice, passion and reason, duty and desire collide, and from this inner tension are born the heroes whose names will live for centuries. One of the earliest and most celebrated tragedies, Romeo and Juliet, was likely written around 1595. The source of the plot was Arthur Brooke's poem, The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet, published in 1562, and itself based on an earlier Italian novella. Shakespeare radically reworked the material, quickening the pace, intensifying the drama, and deepening the characters. He made the lovers younger, more impetuous, more vulnerable. Juliet's monologues, Tybalt's hot temper, Mercutio's zest for life, and Friar Lawrence's restrained wisdom turned the play into a complex fabric in which tragedy springs not from evil, but from the world's imperfection and the elders' unpreparedness for the force of youthful feeling. If Romeo and Juliet is a drama of passion, then Hamlet, written approximately in 1600 to 1601, is a tragedy of reflection. The story of the Danish prince who learns from his father's ghost that the king was murdered and is plunged into doubt became one of the most quoted and many-layered plays in world literature. Hamlet is not a hero of action, but a hero of thought. His to be or not to be is not a rhetorical ornament, but a sincere metaphysical wavering between life as suffering and death as the unknown. His difficulty is not the lack of a goal, but grasping its consequences. And that is what makes his tragedy so universal. The title role in Hamlet was played by Richard Burbage, one of the leading actors of Shakespeare's company. Contemporaries noted his profound immersion in the role, his ability to hold an audience even in moments of silence. The text of the play has reached us in several versions, evidence of its popularity and the lively interest it aroused even in the author's lifetime. The first publication, the so-called Bad Quarto, was likely based on actors' memories or spectators' notes. Only later did a fuller, more authoritative text appear. Among the mature tragedies is Othello, completed around 1603 to 1604. Shakespeare drew on an Italian tale by Cinthio from the collection Hecatomithi, yet once again transformed the material. Othello, a man of outstanding military merit, yet a stranger by origin, honor, and speech, faces Iago, not merely an envious rival, but a master of cold manipulation who dismantles trust with surgical precision. At the center lies the tragedy of blind faith, where love and betrayal walk hand in hand, and words become the chief weapon. The strangling of Desdemona is especially powerful, an action poised at the boundary of passion, fury, and inner collapse. In Macbeth, written in all likelihood in 1606, Shakespeare turns to power, ambition, and fear. The play was composed shortly after James I ascended the throne, and its Scottish theme was likely chosen deliberately. Spurred by the witch's prophecy, Macbeth murders King Duncan and becomes trapped by his own deeds. His path is that of a man steadily losing himself, severed from reality and conscience. Lady Macbeth, decisive and domineering at first, becomes by the end the victim of obsessive visions and guilt. Her famous scene with the damned spot on her hands remains one of the strongest images of tragic madness in the history of the theater. King Lear, probably written in 1605 to 1606, is a tragedy of fatherhood, old age, loss, and illumination. An aged monarch, resolved to lay down power, demands declarations of love from his daughters and rejects the only one who speaks the truth. He loses not only a kingdom, but his reason. The play unfolds as the sequential collapse of a personality. Lear finds himself among fools, beggars, and madmen, stripped of status, family, and certainty. The scene in which he cradles the dead Cordelia is filled with desolation. There is neither moral nor consolation, only the truth of human fragility. No less significant is Richard III, written at the beginning of the 1590s, before the flowering of Shakespearean tragedy. It is not a classical tragedy, but rather a historical chronicle. Yet its protagonist is so vivid that the play is firmly canonical. Richard is an anti-hero, a cynic, a virtuoso of deceit. He addresses the audience directly, making it complicit in his crimes. His road to power is strewn with murders, and his fall is inevitable. And yet he is disturbingly alive, charismatic, dangerous, hypnotic. Here lies Shakespeare's greatest strength. He gives voice to those we ought to fear, and compels us to listen. All these tragedies, so different in plot and tone, share one thing. They do not offer ready answers. There is no single moral, no simple conclusion. Shakespeare does not judge. He shows. He invites the audience to look into human nature with all its fears, weaknesses, desires, and losses. That is why his plays remain urgent. Their heroes are recognizable. Their pain is real. Their choices tormenting. If Shakespeare's tragedies open before us the abysses of the soul, his comedies are spaces of play, freedom, and light. Their lightness, however, is deceptive. Beneath plots crowded with disguises, errors, masks, and songs lie serious reflections on love, dignity, honesty, equality, and understanding. Above all, what distinguishes Shakespeare's comedies from many works of the age is the extraordinary vitality and autonomy of their women. They are not rescued, patronized, or placed on pedestals. They act, choose, argue, set the tempo, and drive the plot. One of the brightest heroines is Beatrice of Much Ado About Nothing, a play written around 1598. The action unfolds in Messina, where two contrasting couples meet. Benedick and Beatrice, sharp-tongued, intelligent, independent, and Claudio, an hero, trusting, naive, romantically idealized. The skirmishes between Benedick and Beatrice are among the wittiest exchanges in theater. There is no empty rhetoric here, but a spark, not of malice, but of the deep understanding that love demands honesty rather than masks. Legend has it that Shakespeare wrote these scenes with specific performers in mind. Will Kemp, and perhaps a young actor playing female roles, for women were still forbidden the stage. In As You Like It, 1599, we meet Rosalind, whose inner strength powers the entire play. Banished from court, she flees to the forest of Arden disguised as a young man, and in that male guise tutors Orlando in love, tests his feelings, and plays with his words and image. Disguise here is not merely a theatrical trick, but a means of revealing the essence of a person. As a youth, Rosalind becomes free, and in that freedom true closeness arises. Their dialogues are at once game, lesson, and confession. The motif of disguise as an instrument of understanding returns in Twelfth Night, one of Shakespeare's most musical and delicate comedies, likely completed by 1601. Viola, who believes her brother lost to shipwreck, dons male clothing and becomes Cesario, servant to Duke Orsino. Orsino loves Olivia, but sends Cesario as his envoy. Paradoxically, Olivia falls for the disguised page, while Viola herself loves the Duke. The triangle resolves happily, yet along the way reveals the finest shades of love, illusion, and self-perception. The fool Feste, with his songs and barbed truths, supplies a philosophical counterpoint to the story's airy grace. Shakespeare's comedies often fuse the exalted with the popular. A Midsummer Night's Dream is a shining example. Written in the mid-1590s, it interlaces several planes: the courtly wedding of Theseus and Hippolyta, the quarrel and reconciliation of the fairy rulers Oberon and Titania, the love confusions of four Athenian youths, and the rustic play staged by artisans. At the center is love as enchantment, as dream, as a force beyond human control. Through elves, love potions, and transformations, Shakespeare says that human feelings, however wild, still deserve acceptance. Nick Bottom, granted an ass's head in Titania's favor, is not a joke at someone's expense, but an image of the world's absurd beauty, where even a weaver may be loved by a fairy queen. More complex in tone is The Merchant of Venice, written around 1596 to 1597. Formerly a comedy, it beats with a tragic pulse. Portia, resolute, educated, clear-sighted, disguises herself as a male lawyer to save the man she loves from a legal trap set by Shylock, the Jewish moneylender. The courtroom scene, with the famous plea for mercy, "The quality of mercy is not strained," is astonishing in its power. Yet Shylock himself troubles the heart. Not a simple antagonist, but a man scorned, deceived, and forced to convert. In that ambivalence, laughter and bitterness, justice and bias, lies the special tension of Shakespeare's best plays. The turn from pure comedy to the dramatic is especially visible in the late plays such as The Winter's Tale and Cymbeline. These works are often called romances, or tragicomedies. Separation, error, and disguise remain, but the dominant theme becomes forgiveness, reunion, rebirth. In The Winter's Tale, King Leontes slanders his innocent wife, loses her and their daughter, and years later finds them again. The play is not about punishment, but repentance. Its ending feels like a gentle farewell, not only to a hero, but perhaps to the theater itself. In all these stories, the verbal duels of Beatrice and Benedict, Viola's masquerade, Orlando's dawning insight, Shylock's rage, a living human voice resounds. Shakespeare offers no templates. He shows that love is varied, relationships are complex, truth is incomplete. Yet through it all run humor, musicality, and inward kindness. Even his fools are not merely comic relief, but bearers of hidden meanings, the last word that sets things right. By the beginning of the 1610 years, William Shakespeare was no longer simply living in London and writing plays. He had become part of England's cultural foundation. His name meant success, his plays were eagerly staged, and his company, the King's Men, enjoyed the monarch's protection. In this period, however, he increasingly turned not to struggle, revenge, and fury, but to remorse, forgiveness, and reconciliation. The late plays take on a softer, more philosophical tone. They are no longer comedies or tragedies in the usual sense, but the so-called romances, or plays of reconciliation, in which characters lose to regain, suffer to forgive, and act to restore the lost. One of the first of these was Pericles, written around 1607 to 1608, probably in collaboration with George Wilkins. It tells of the wanderings of the Phoenician prince Pericles, who survives shipwreck, loses wife and daughter, and after many years finds them again. Filled with storms, marvels, and coincidences, the play struck contemporaries ambivalently, perhaps due to its unstable text or structure. Yet the recognition seen with the daughter, who has preserved chastity and dignity under harsh conditions, possesses deep emotional force. There are no cries here, only silence, more eloquent than any monologue. Cymbeline and The Winter's Tale followed. In Cymbeline, Shakespeare blends tragedy, comedy, and political chronicle, crafting a story in which a father misjudges his daughter and a husband his wife, yet all ends in reunion and pardon. In The Winter's Tale, jealousy and suspicion drive King Leontes to wreck his family and cause his young son's death, but after 16 years he rediscovers his daughter and, by a wondrous turn, his wife Hermione, thought dead. The final scene, in which Hermione's statue comes to life, was received as a true miracle, a reward for repentance and faith. It is one of Shakespeare's most unusual moments. There is no outward magic, only the inward kind, born of forgiveness and time. The summit of the late style is The Tempest, written around 1610 to 1611. It is the last play fully attributed to Shakespeare alone. The action unfolds on a mysterious island where the exiled Duke Prospero, master of magical arts, lives with his daughter. He conjures a shipwreck to bring his enemies within reach, yet in the end, renounces vengeance, forgives them, frees the spirits, breaks his staff, and abjures his magic. Many scholars see in Prospero a reflection of Shakespeare himself, the wise creator concluding his career and bidding farewell to art and audience. His words, "Now my charms are all o'erthrown," read as an open goodbye to the theater. The final play, written with John Fletcher, The Two Noble Kinsmen, appeared around 1613. One senses weariness of form, the plot is less taut, the figures lack their former depth. This does not make the play worthless, but Shakespeare seems to withdraw, yielding the stage to a new generation. He departs not with a fanfare, but with a slight bow, giving others the floor. Around the same time, he left London and returned to Stratford upon Avon. His house, New Place, purchased in 1597, was the largest in town, with a spacious garden, servants, and the standing of a respected property owner. He lived near his elder daughter, Susanna, married to the physician John Hall, and his younger daughter, Judith, for whom he soon arranged a marriage. He managed household affairs, handled property, watched his finances, sued debtors, and is here and there mentioned in town records. The theater now lived only in memory. In March of 1616, Shakespeare made his will. It is framed in the typical legal style of the time, yet certain details stand out. He leaves bequests to friends, relatives, daughters, and to his wife, Anne Hathaway, the famous second best bed, about which countless interpretations have been written. Perhaps it was their marital bed rather than an insult. He also mentions his theatrical partners and friends, John Heminger, Henry Condell, and Richard Burbage. with whom he shared the stage and renown. On the 23rd of April, 1616, a month after drawing up the will, William Shakespeare died. He was 52 years old. The cause and circumstances are unknown. The chronicles are silent. He was buried in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, where he had been baptized in infancy. Over his grave appeared an epitaph: "Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Who composed it remains uncertain. Perhaps Shakespeare himself. The inscription speaks of a wish for rest, of the body, and of the work. The farewell was modest. No reports survive of a funeral oration, no royal condolences. Yet 7 years later, in 1623, his friends and colleagues published the first folio, a collection of 36 plays, including many not previously printed. Thanks to that book, much of the oeuvre has reached us. On its title page, a graven portrait of Shakespeare appears for the first time, and in the preface we read, "He was not of an age, but for all time." Thus ended the life of a man who left no autobiography, kept no diary, avoided political quarrels, and did not seek fame, yet changed the theater, poetry, and the language itself. His departure was untriumphant, his words remained, and they continue to sound. William Shakespeare died in 1616, and in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, where he had been baptized and where he made his last confession, a tombstone bearing his name was set up. 7 years after his death, the famous First Folio appeared, a collection of plays prepared by his friends and colleagues. It would seem we have a completed story. A man lived, wrote, acted on stage, achieved success, and was recognized as a great dramatist. Yet over time, especially beginning in the 18th century, doubts arose. Could a man from Stratford, without a university education, without court connections, and with a rather modest biographical trail, truly be the author of plays marked by such deep philosophy and such knowledge of law, politics, medicine, history, foreign geography, and court etiquette? These doubts gave rise to what is now called the Shakespeare authorship question. Its essence is not the denial of Shakespeare's existence as a historical person. That is confirmed by documents, signatures, legal records, and contemporary testimony. The question is something else. Was he truly the author of the plays that bear his name? Or is that name a mask, a pseudonym behind which someone else is concealed? The first serious doubts surfaced in the 18th century when Shakespeare's biographers tried to reconstruct the writer's image. They encountered an unexpected problem. We know remarkably little about Shakespeare. There are no surviving letters, no diaries, no drafts. His will details property, houses, land, furniture, but does not mention books, manuscripts, or theatrical papers. He never studied at a university, did not, according to official records, travel beyond England, and held no government post. How could a man of such origins write as if he knew the inner workings of a royal court, Latin rhetoric, Roman history, and moral philosophy? Against this background, alternative candidates emerged. One of the first was Francis Bacon, a philosopher, lawyer, and scientist, author of numerous treatises. His supporters argued that he could not publicly associate himself with the theater, then regarded as a low art, and therefore used Shakespeare as a front. The most ardent enthusiasts hunted for ciphers in the texts, anagrams, number codes, supposedly pointing to Bacon. Another candidate was Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, an aristocrat and poet, educated and familiar with foreign cultures. His admirers claimed that only he possessed the knowledge required to write Shakespeare's plays. In favor of this view, they noted that de Vere had visited Italy, of which Shakespeare wrote with such confidence it seemed he had walked the streets of Verona or Venice himself. The single serious objection remained that de Vere died in 1604, many years before The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, Henry VIII, and other late plays were written. Supporters of the Earl, however, insisted that all the plays had been composed earlier and that publication was delayed. Other candidates were proposed as well. The playwright Christopher Marlowe, who, it is claimed, staged his own death in 1593 and continued to write under another's name. William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, and even Queen Elizabeth I. Some suggested that Shakespeare was merely the frontman for a collective of authors. Arguments included stylistic differences between early and late plays, evidence of co-authorship in some dramas, and variant spellings of the Shakespeare surname in historical sources. Yet history and textual scholarship did not stand aside. Literary historians, linguists, and stylometric analysts have repeatedly studied the texts, authors' practices, and theatrical contexts of the age. The overwhelming majority of modern researchers conclude that the man named William Shakespeare of Stratford was indeed the author, or at least the principal and acknowledged creator, of the plays. His name is mentioned during his lifetime in connection with specific productions. He was a shareholder in a theatrical company, and his colleagues included his plays in the first folio, supplying recollections and verses in honor of the author. Ben Jonson, his contemporary and rival, explicitly calls him the greatest dramatist of their time. What then explains the persistence of doubt? Likely not a lack of evidence, but the magnitude of the legacy itself. Shakespeare proved so complex, multifaceted, and profound that it seems unbelievable one person could contain so much dramatic mastery, historical knowledge, psychological insight, lyrical power. Anti-Shakespeareanism is, in a sense, a form of veneration, a refusal to believe such talent could belong to just a man, and not to someone elite, someone secret. Supporters of alternative theories were especially active in the 19th and 20th centuries. In Germany, the United States, and Russia, societies formed to publish pamphlets and journals devoted to the authorship question. At times, the hypotheses became a cultural game. Seekers pursued hidden symbols, allusions, traces of secret societies. But for all the enthusiasm, not one of these theories was supported by a literary corpus as large and resilient as Shakespeare's. Neither Bacon nor De Vere nor Marlowe left anything to set beside King Lear, Hamlet, or Othello. The Shakespeare question still fascinates, not only historians, but philosophers, writers, and screenwriters. It is discussed at universities, conferences, and in films and novels. Perhaps its essence lies not in naming a different author, but in reflecting on the very phenomenon of genius, its origins and nature. Whoever wrote Shakespeare's plays did so with such power that the name Shakespeare has become less a person than a symbol. When William Shakespeare died in April of 1616, he was buried in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, without state honors, without mausoleum inscriptions, without any sense that the world had lost one who would later be judged among the greatest dramatists in human history. And yet, despite the modesty of those farewell rites, his plays had already begun to live a life of their own, on the stage, in printed collections, in the memories of actors and audiences. Decades passed, then centuries, and Shakespeare's name not only failed to fade, but became a symbol of art, of the word, of the theater, and of human nature itself. The first step toward that immortality was taken in 1623, when the dramatist's friends and colleagues, the actors John Heminger and Henry Condell, published the first folio, a collection of 36 plays, many of which had never been printed and might have been lost forever. Thanks to this volume, we know Macbeth, The Tempest, Julius Caesar, As You Like It, and Twelfth Night. Their labor was an act of memory and recognition that effectively laid the foundation of the Shakespearean canon. With time, the first folio became an object of bibliophilic devotion, and Shakespeare himself a classic of English and world literature. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Shakespeare's plays never left the stage, but they were often revised and adapted. In the era of the Restoration, when English theaters reopened after the Puritan ban, they catered to new tastes and altered Shakespeare. Tragedies ended happily, monologues were shortened, scenes rewritten to fit fashion. In one staging, King Lear concluded with the wedding of Cordelia and Edgar. Only in the 19th century did a movement arise to restore the original texts and honor the author's intent. In the same era, the image of Shakespeare as a national genius took shape, a universal thinker whose work transcends time and place. The 19th century became an age of Shakespeare's triumph beyond England. His plays were translated and staged across Europe, in Germany, France, Italy, Poland, and Russia. German romantics such as August Schlegel saw in Shakespeare the embodiment of creative freedom. In Russia, he was perceived as a spiritual kin to Pushkin and Dostoevsky. The translations of Lunin and Vyazemsky, and later of Pasternak, conveyed not merely the plots, but the poetic density of the original. Thus Hamlet, Othello, Romeo and Juliet became not only English plays, but also German, Russian, and Italian. So deeply did they take root in other cultures. The 20th century opened a new stage for Shakespeare, the cinema. As early as 1899, the first screen adaptation appeared, a fragment of the life and death of King John starring Herbert Beerbohm Tree. Thereafter, Shakespeare inspired filmmakers worldwide. Laurence Olivier filmed Hamlet, Henry V, and Richard III, giving them epic depth. Orson Welles reimagined Macbeth and Othello. Akira Kurosawa transposed Macbeth to Japan as Throne of Blood, a samurai tragedy of power and destiny. Baz Luhrmann offered Romeo plus Juliet against a modern American backdrop while keeping Shakespeare's text. Even Disney's The Lion King bears the recognizable structure of Hamlet. Alongside theater and film, Shakespeare's plays entered the culture of language itself. By linguists' estimates, more than 1,700 words in English are first attested in his works. He also gave the world dozens of phrases that have become fixed expressions. To be or not to be, break the ice, wild goose chase, in a pickle, wear one's heart on one's sleeve, all that glitters is not gold. Many are no longer recognized as Shakespearean, yet they live on, in everyday speech, in advertising, in headlines and songs. Shakespeare has become part of education across the globe. He is read in schools, studied at universities, analyzed in courses on literature, philosophy, and theater. His works are staged on amateur platforms and in the world's leading houses, from London's Globe to the Comédie Française, from the Moscow Art Theatre to Broadway. His plays are translated and adapted, annotated and reinterpreted, forming an endless chain of readings, each adding new meaning to his texts. A distinctive feature of the Shakespearean legacy is its openness to infinite interpretation. Hamlet can be staged as psychological drama, philosophical tragedy, or even political pamphlet. Julius Caesar can be read as a study of a republic's collapse, The Tempest as a parable of forgiveness, Macbeth as a chronicle of addiction to power. The plays transfer easily to any era and context, and yet never lose their inner force. They live because they speak of the permanent things: fear, love, betrayal, choice, power, pain, and hope. It is this universality, not only the poetic gift, that makes Shakespeare immortal. He did not merely address his contemporaries. He offered a language with which to speak about the human being in any century. His characters are neither allegories nor mere figures of their time. They are living images in whom each reader recognizes something personal, something his or her own. Thus Shakespeare, born in a small town, living a comparatively unassuming life, and dying without great fanfare, became a voice that sounds across the centuries. He turned into a symbol, not of one age, but of the very nature of theater, of the word, and of the human soul.